Let me tell you a story, not of kings or far-off lands, but of a young nation, barely 80 years old, already tearing itself apart from within. The year is 1850. The United States stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It is a land full of ambition, invention, and promise. Railroads cut through the forests. Telegraph wires hum with messages. Cities rise. The American dream seems within reach. But beneath the surface there is a wound carved by slavery, and it is beginning to bleed. Let me tell you a story of a nation that stood on the edge of a blade, its soul torn between principle and power, between progress and the past. In the winter of 1860, the United States of America, still a young nation, was anything but united. Storm clouds gathered over the fields of Georgia, over the ports of South Carolina, and even over the marble columns of Washington, D.C. Let me tell you a story of a nation that stood on the edge of a blade, its soul torn between principle and power, between progress and the past. In the winter of 1860, the United States of America, still a young nation, was anything but united. Storm clouds gathered over the fields of Georgia, over the ports of South Carolina, and even over the marble columns of Washington, D.C. The country had grown vast. From the rocky shores of New England to the golden coast of California, railroads cut through forests and telegraph wires stitched cities together like nervous threads of progress. But beneath that growth, there was a deeper tear, one made not a policy but a people. The issue of slavery, what the South called a way of life, and the North increasingly saw as a moral blight, had become unignorable. Tensions had boiled for decades. Congress had scrambled to contain them with laws like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each was a bandage over a wound that refused to heal. The balance between free and slave states was fragile, a seesaw teetering in the wind.
Then came the spark. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president with a message: slavery must not expand. He did not call for abolition outright, but he made it clear the United States could no longer be half slave and half free. To the South, this was an existential threat. To them, the Union had betrayed the Constitution by daring to question the institution that defined their economy, their politics, their very identity. South Carolina acted first. On December 20th, 1860, its legislature voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Church bells rang. Cannon fire echoed in Charleston. Crowds cheered as the state's representatives signed the Ordinance of Secession. For many white Southerners, it felt like liberation. But it was just the beginning. By February 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had followed. Representatives from these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. They wrote a constitution that resembled the U.S. Constitution, but with one crucial difference: it explicitly protected slavery. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president, a man of military discipline, political experience, and unwavering belief in the Southern cause. In the North, the mood was one of disbelief. Some hoped the South was bluffing. Others insisted the Union should let them go. But Abraham Lincoln, not yet sworn in, watched the crisis deepen. Outgoing President James Buchanan declared secession illegal, but also said the federal government had no authority to stop it. As Southern states seized federal forts, arsenals, and customs houses, Washington stood paralyzed. One by one, symbols of federal authority were taken, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with the threat of violence. The national flag lowered, the Confederate banner raised, and still the North waited. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. His first inaugural address was not a call to war. It was a plea. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He begged the South to reconsider, to understand that the Union was older than the Constitution, that it could not simply be dissolved. He ended with these words: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But passion had already broken much more. In Charleston Harbor, one final flashpoint remained: Fort Sumter, a granite island fort, flying the stars and stripes, surrounded by Confederate-controlled land. The Union garrison, led by Major Robert Anderson, was running out of supplies. Lincoln, hoping to avoid escalation, informed South Carolina that he would send ships, but only with food, not weapons. To Confederate leaders, it didn't matter. Any federal presence was intolerable. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. The sky over Charleston lit with the glow of artillery. For 34 hours, the bombardment raged. The fort returned fire but was hopelessly outgunned. On April 13th, the Union garrison surrendered. Not a single soldier died in the battle. But make no mistake, this was the moment the war began. The next day, Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The North erupted. Men flooded recruiting stations. Flags were hoisted on city halls. In Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, church bells rang and crowds rallied. For many Northerners, it was a war not only for Union, but for the very idea of America. But Lincoln's call to arms had consequences. For more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded in protest. They would not fight against their southern neighbors. In Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital moved from Montgomery. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, loyalties split families in two. Brothers took up arms against brothers. Churches divided. Even entire communities fractured along invisible lines. The war, now fully ignited, revealed the fragile truth: the United States had never truly been united. In both the Union and the Confederacy, the people were told this would be a short, glorious conflict. Boys rushed off to war expecting to be home by Christmas. Politicians believed the other side would back down after a few decisive battles. They were all wrong. By the summer of 1861, thousands had enlisted on both sides. The Union wore blue. The Confederates wore gray. Two nations now faced each other, not just with differing flags, but with incompatible futures. To the North, the war was about preserving the Union, about proving that democracy could survive its own contradictions. To the South, it was about defending their way of life, their independence, and their belief in states' rights, though always bound to the defense of slavery. Behind the banners and uniforms, however, were millions of ordinary Americans, farmers, clerks, teachers, immigrants, and freedmen, each with their own reasons for marching to war. And looming above it all was the great, unanswered question: what kind of nation would America become? That question would be answered not in speeches or treaties, but in mud, blood, and fire. The war had begun, and there was no turning back when glory faded and the reality of war took hold. Let me tell you a story of bold uniforms and bright banners, of songs sung by campfires and cheers in city squares. But soon, those songs would be drowned out by the thunder of artillery, and the bright banners would hang limp in the smoky haze of battlefields. In April 1861, the Civil War had officially begun. But few understood what that truly meant. Both North and South entered the conflict believing it would be over quickly. In Washington, people scoffed at the idea of a long campaign. Many believed a single, decisive battle would bring the South to heel. In the Confederacy, confidence was equally high. Their soldiers would fight with honor and courage, what Northerners, they said, could never match. Men rushed to enlist. In the Union, young boys lied about their age to join the army. Fathers said goodbye to their families with pride in their eyes and rifles on their shoulders. Confederate volunteers rode to camps with flags waving, vowing to defend their soil from tyranny. But none of them truly knew what lay ahead. The first real clash came on July 21st, 1861, just months after Fort Sumter in northern Virginia at a place called Manassas Junction, near a little stream called Bull Run. Thousands of spectators traveled from Washington to watch the fight. They brought picnic baskets. Some brought opera glasses. Members of Congress came with their families, believing they would witness a Union victory by afternoon and be home by supper. But war had other plans. Union troops under General Irvin McDowell marched out with confidence. Opposing them was the Confederate Army led by Generals P.G.E. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. For many soldiers on both sides, this was their first time seeing battle, their first time hearing the scream of cannon fire, the chaos of musket volleys, the screams of the wounded. At first, the Union forces pushed forward. Confederate lines wavered. It seemed the war might indeed end quickly. Then came a moment that changed everything. General Thomas J. Jackson, a stern and quiet man from Virginia, stood firm with his brigade. Bullets whizzed through the air. Shells exploded around them. Yet Jackson and his men did not retreat. Another general pointed to him and shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The name stuck. From that moment forward, he was known as Stonewall Jackson. His stand rallied the Confederate troops. They counterattacked. Union lines began to break. Soon, the unthinkable happened. Union forces began to retreat in panic, crashing through the very civilians who had come to watch. The roads back to Washington clogged with wagons, horses, and terrified soldiers. It was not a grand, clean victory. It was a rout. Bull Run was a brutal awakening. Nearly 5,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The illusions of quick triumph were shattered. Both sides now understood this would be a long, bloody, and costly war. After Bull Run, both the Union and Confederacy knew they needed to organize, train, and prepare for a conflict unlike any in their history. In the North, President Lincoln appointed a new general to take command of the Army of the Potomac, a young, ambitious officer named George B. McClellan. He brought energy and discipline, transforming raw recruits into a professional force. But he was cautious, too cautious, some would later say, and often overestimated the enemy's strength. In the South, General Robert E. Lee was beginning to rise in reputation, though at this stage he had not yet become the legendary commander he would soon be. The Confederacy relied heavily on local militias and the belief in the righteousness of their cause. Supplies were scarce, but morale remained high. In both camps, disease took a terrible toll. For every soldier killed in battle, 2 would die from illness, cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Camp doctors did their best, but the knowledge of medicine lagged behind the scale of suffering. Letters home began to reflect the change. No longer filled with dreams of quick victory, they spoke of mud, blood, and death. The romantic vision of war gave way to the grim truth. After Bull Run, both the Union and Confederacy knew they needed to organize, train, and prepare for a conflict unlike any in their history. In the North, President Lincoln appointed a new general to take command of the Army of the Potomac, a young, ambitious officer named George B. McClellan. He brought energy and discipline, transforming raw recruits into a professional force. But he was cautious, too cautious, some would later say, and often overestimated the enemy's strength. In the South, General Robert E. Lee was beginning to rise in reputation, though at this stage, he had not yet become the legendary commander he would soon be. The Confederacy relied heavily on local militias and the belief in the righteousness of their cause. Supplies were scarce, but morale remained high. In both camps, disease took a terrible toll. For every soldier killed in battle, 2 would die from illness, cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Camp doctors did their best, but the knowledge of medicine lagged behind the scale of suffering. Letters home began to reflect the change. No longer filled with dreams of quick victory, they spoke of mud, blood, and death. The romantic vision of war gave way to the grim truth. While Virginia drew the spotlight, crucial battles were also unfolding in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, little known at the time, launched aggressive campaigns along the Mississippi River. In early 1862, he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, securing Kentucky and opening a path into Tennessee. His victories gave the North hope and gave Grant a reputation for relentless determination. At Fort Donelson, when Confederate forces asked for terms, Grant's reply was clear and bold. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. He became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. These victories were vital. They cut into the Confederate heartland and showed the Union could strike deep. But they came at a cost. At the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, Grant's forces were caught off guard by a surprise Confederate attack. The first day was chaos, Union lines nearly collapsed. But Grant held firm. Reinforcements arrived. On the second day, he counterattacked and pushed the Confederates back. Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles yet, over 23,000 casualties in just 2 days. The country was stunned. This was not a war of honor and cavalry charges. It was a war of attrition, of trenches, smoke, and slaughter. For the people back home, both North and South, the war was no longer distant. In the North, newspapers printed long lists of the dead. In the South, towns mourned sons who would never return. Factories in the Union ramped up production, guns, boots, uniforms, and ironclads. Women stepped into roles as nurses, clerks, and factory workers. The entire nation, from farmer to senator, was now engulfed in the war effort. In border states like Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, loyalties were torn. Families were divided. Violence broke out even in towns far from the front lines. Guerrilla warfare and raids became common. This was not just a war between governments. It was a war within the American soul. A glimpse at what lay ahead by the end of 1861 and into early 1862. Both sides had suffered devastating losses. Yet neither was close to breaking. The Union had manpower, industry, and ships, but struggled with leadership and strategy. The Confederacy had talented generals and the advantage of defending familiar ground, but lacked supplies, railroads, and foreign support. And in the shadows of every battle loomed the central, burning question: what would become of slavery? So far, Lincoln had avoided turning the war into a crusade against slavery. He feared pushing border states into the arms of the Confederacy. But the pressure was growing, especially from Black Americans, many of whom were fleeing plantations and offering to fight for the Union cause. Soon, the war's purpose would begin to shift. But for now, the battlefield would continue to teach its brutal lessons, one charge, one cannon blast, one heartbreak at a time. Let me tell you a story, not of cannon fire or cavalry charges, but of ink on parchment, of ideals forged in the crucible of war, and of a single document that forever altered the soul of a nation. By the second year of the American Civil War, the conflict had dragged far beyond what anyone had imagined. The early illusion that it would be brief and glorious had long faded. The fields of Shiloh, Antietam, and Bull Run were soaked with blood. Families mourned in both North and South. And yet, a deeper question loomed behind the gunfire, a question that had not yet been officially answered. What was this war really about? At the beginning, President Abraham Lincoln was clear in his stance. The war was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. He feared that turning the war into a crusade for abolition would alienate border states like Kentucky and Missouri, possibly driving them into the arms of the Confederacy. Lincoln knew that he had to walk a political tightrope, balancing the needs of national unity against the moral imperative that was stirring in his conscience and in the hearts of millions. But the ground was shifting. Slavery was not just a moral issue, it was a strategic one. As the Union Army moved deeper into Confederate territory, enslaved people began fleeing plantations, crossing into Union lines. They were not just escaping bondage, they were undermining the Southern war effort, which depended on their labor. These men, women, and children came not as passive victims, but as active agents of their own freedom, often offering to serve as guides, laborers, even soldiers. Union generals, unsure of how to proceed, began declaring these escapees as contraband of war, refusing to return them to their enslavers. Pressure mounted in Washington. Abolitionists demanded action. Formerly enslaved men like Frederick Douglass spoke out passionately, insisting that the war could not be won without striking at the root of the Confederacy's strength, slavery itself. Lincoln listened. Slowly, methodically, he came to a conclusion: the Union could not be saved without ending slavery. The two were now inseparable. If the nation was to be reborn, it could not carry the chains of its past into the future. But Lincoln was a strategist as well as a moralist. He needed the right moment. A premature proclamation could backfire. He waited for a Union victory, one significant enough to give weight to his words. That moment came at Antietam in September 1862. Though the battle itself was more of a bloody stalemate, the single bloodiest day in American history with over 22,000 casualties, it allowed Lincoln to present it as a turning point. 5 days later, he issued a bold declaration that on the first day of January, all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. This was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a warning, not yet law. It gave the Confederacy 100 days to rejoin the Union or face the abolition of slavery in their territories. They did not comply. And so, on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law. The document, though limited in scope, it only applied to Confederate-held areas, not the border states, carried enormous symbolic weight. With one stroke of the pen, Lincoln redefined the war. It was no longer just about preserving a fractured nation. It was now also about transforming that nation, about destroying the institution that had haunted its conscience since birth. From that day forward, the world saw the United States not merely as a nation at war with itself, but as a country fighting to uphold the ideal of human liberty. Britain and France, which had considered recognizing the Confederacy, now hesitated. Their citizens would not support intervention on behalf of a slaveholding government. Within the Union Army, the proclamation unleashed a new wave of purpose. Thousands of black men enlisted, forming regiments like the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry. They fought with honor, with valor, and often at great personal risk, knowing that capture could mean execution or re-enslavement. These soldiers weren't just fighting for a flag. They were fighting for the very promise of America, a promise that had excluded them for generations. Now they carried it forward. For the Confederacy, the proclamation confirmed their fears. They had long claimed that the North intended to destroy their way of life, and now it was written into law. Southern leaders scoffed at the document. They dismissed it as meaningless since Lincoln had no power over their territory. But they were wrong. Even in the South, the proclamation sent shockwaves. Enslaved people heard whispers of freedom. Songs spread through the night, sung in hushed tones, "Go down, Moses, let my people go." Some fled. Some resisted. Some simply waited for the blue uniforms to arrive. The proclamation did not end slavery on its own. That would come later with the 13th Amendment. But it lit the fire. It gave the war a soul. And it forced every American, North and South, to reckon with the moral stakes of the conflict. For Lincoln, it was a moment of profound transformation. He once said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And in the Emancipation Proclamation, he gave voice to that belief, not in a speech, not in a sermon, but in the form of law. It was, in his own words, the central act of my administration and the greatest event of the 19th century. From that moment forward, the war was not just about saving a union. It was about remaking it into something truer, braver, and more just. And though the battles would rage on, and many more lives would be lost, the course of history had shifted. The road to justice would be long and incomplete. But for the first time, the United States had taken its first true step toward becoming what it claimed to be. Let me take you back, not to the thunder of battle, but to the quiet, difficult moments in between. To muddy fields, makeshift tents, lonely letters, and kitchens that cooked with nearly nothing. While generals planned their strategies and armies clashed across the South and North, the war was also lived every day by ordinary people, soldiers in blue and gray, and civilians whose homes became war zones. For the soldiers, life was anything but glorious. Young men from farms, cities, and mountain towns had marched off in 1861 with drums beating and flags waving. Many believed the war would last weeks, maybe months. They couldn't have imagined what lay ahead: years of hunger, sickness, cold, and fear. Camp life was monotonous and miserable. Soldiers slept on straw or bare earth, often in leaky tents or open fields. Disease was their constant companion. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia claimed more lives than bullets. Food was hardtack, a hard biscuit, salted pork, or whatever they could scavenge. Many went days without a real meal. Clean water was rare. So was medical care. If a soldier was wounded, even slightly, there was a terrifying chance his limb would be amputated with no anesthesia beyond whiskey and willpower. They passed time writing letters home, filled with longing for mothers, sweethearts, and normal life. Some wrote poetry. Others kept journals. They clung to routine. Drills, guard duty, and letters from home kept them sane. In the South, Confederate soldiers faced even harsher conditions. As the war dragged on, supplies dwindled. They wore patched uniforms, marched barefoot, and ate whatever could be foraged. Their pay, when it came at all, was often in worthless Confederate currency. Still, many fought on, not just for slavery or secession, but out of loyalty to their state, their comrades, or the soil of their ancestors. Meanwhile, at home, war turned everyday life upside down. For civilians in the North, factories boomed, and industry shifted to support the Union war effort. Women went to work in textile mills and ammunition plants. Children helped chew rolling cartridges, packing rations. Cities swelled with troops and war refugees. Prices soared. So did anxiety. Newspapers brought daily headlines from the front. Lists of the dead, the wounded, the missing. Women stepped into roles they had never known before. Some became nurses on the battlefield, like the famous Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross. Others organized fundraisers, knitted socks, and wrote letters to strangers in uniform. Many simply struggled to hold families together, managing farms or businesses in the absence of their husbands and sons. In the Confederate South, civilian life collapsed under the weight of war. Blockades cut off trade. Crops rotted without labor. Families starved. Towns once quiet and prosperous became hospitals or refugee camps. Homes were destroyed or occupied. And as Union troops pushed deeper into Southern territory, war came directly to the doorstep of ordinary citizens. Southern women, once expected to remain quiet and obedient, became fierce survivors. They learned to plow fields, barter for supplies, and hide their livestock from foraging armies. Some even became spies or couriers, passing secret messages beneath their skirts or in baskets of bread. In both North and South, enslaved people faced a different reality. For many, the war was not a tragedy but an opportunity, a chance to escape bondage and claim freedom. Some fled to Union lines, risking death for the hope of liberty. Others resisted more subtly, slowing their labor, sabotaging equipment, or helping Union scouts. They knew the stakes. This war wasn't just about the Union or secession, it was about their very lives. Children, too, lived this war. Some watched fathers leave and never return. Others saw their homes burned. In southern towns, children played among broken wagons and crumbling chimneys. In the North, boys sold newspapers shouting the latest news from Gettysburg or Vicksburg. Some lied about their age and joined the army, carrying drums or flags into battle. Everywhere there was loss, and everywhere there was resilience. A soldier clutching a Bible in the mud. A mother boiling scraps to feed 5 hungry mouths. A girl writing poetry in a burned-out farmhouse. A freedman picking up a musket to fight for a nation that had never recognized his humanity. This was the Civil War not seen in strategy maps or history books, but in the quiet courage of everyday people. They were not the ones who wrote speeches or signed treaties, but they lived the war in every heartbeat, and they shaped its legacy. Let me take you now to the turning point. The moment when the tide of war began to shift, not with a single shot, but with the roar of cannon across Pennsylvania, the burning fields of Georgia, and the long, grinding march toward Richmond. The summer of 1863 brought the war to its bloodiest crescendo at a quiet crossroads town called Gettysburg. For 2 years, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, had won victories against larger Union armies. His reputation seemed untouchable, his men fiercely loyal. But in June, emboldened by success and seeking to draw Northern armies away from the South and perhaps even force a peace, Lee marched north into Pennsylvania. There, over the course of 3 brutal days, from July 1st to July 3rd, the largest battle ever fought on American soil erupted. At Gettysburg, over 160,000 men clashed in rolling fields and rocky hills. Union General George Meade commanded the Army of the Potomac, hastily positioned to defend the high ground. The fighting was savage. Devil's Den, Little Round Top, and Cemetery Ridge became names etched in blood. On the 3rd day, Lee ordered Pickett's charge, a doomed frontal assault across open ground against entrenched Union forces. It was a slaughter. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were mowed down. The Southern Army staggered back, defeated though not destroyed. That same week, far to the west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, gaining control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Gettysburg and Vicksburg, together, marked the beginning of the end. Though the war would grind on for nearly 2 more years, the Confederacy would never again mount a major offensive into the North. Still, the road to victory was long and paved in suffering. In 1864, President Lincoln faced re-election and the country was weary. The war seemed endless. Casualties soared, but Lincoln found his general, Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of all Union armies, launched a bold, relentless campaign to crush the Confederacy through attrition. While Grant pushed against Lee in Virginia, another general, William Tecumseh Sherman, began a campaign of fire and steel in the South. Sherman understood something radical, that to truly end the war, the South's ability and will to fight had to be broken, not just on the battlefield, but at home. In the fall of 1864, he began his infamous March to the Sea. From Atlanta to Savannah, Sherman's troops cut a 60-mile wide path of destruction through Georgia. They destroyed railroads, burned crops, dismantled factories. They did not target civilians directly, but they shattered the Southern economy and morale. This was total war. Not just armies fighting armies, but war against the infrastructure of rebellion. Sherman's march devastated the South, but it also helped Lincoln win re-election. As Atlanta burned, hope rekindled in the North. The president who had once been uncertain of his political future now stood firm, promising not just victory, but a new birth of freedom. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Grant and Lee were locked in a war of attrition. From the Wilderness to Cold Harbor to Petersburg, Grant hammered Lee's army again and again, refusing to retreat. The cost was horrific. Thousands died in muddy trenches and dense forests. But unlike his predecessors, Grant did not back down. By early 1865, Lee's army was exhausted, starving, surrounded, and cut off from reinforcements. On April 2, 1865, Union troops finally broke through the lines at Petersburg. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell shortly after. Fires lit by retreating Confederates turned the city into an inferno. The end was near. On April 9th, in the small town of Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee met with Ulysses S. Grant to surrender. The meeting was quiet, solemn, and deeply human. Lee arrived in full dress uniform, Grant in a muddy field jacket. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be allowed to return home with horses for spring planting. There would be no executions, no humiliation. The war, for most, was over. News of Lee's surrender swept the nation. Bells rang in Washington. Tears flowed in the streets of northern cities. Union soldiers cheered, while others simply wept in silence. But the scars were deep. Over 600,000 Americans were dead. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Families were shattered, and the question now loomed. When the cannons fell silent in April 1865, the war that had torn America apart for 4 years finally neared its end. But even in its final moments, the Civil War delivered both triumph and tragedy, peace and sorrow. After the fall of Richmond, the once proud capital of the Confederacy, General Robert E. Lee knew the fight was over. His Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most formidable force, was outnumbered, starving, and surrounded by Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee had hoped to link up with remaining Confederate forces in North Carolina, but Union troops cut off every route. His men were barefoot, weak, and desperate. Some had gone days without food. Others dropped their rifles and simply walked away. On April 9, 1865, in the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee met Grant to surrender. The meeting was simple and historic. Lee, always dignified, arrived in full dress uniform, sword polished, boots shining. Grant, dusty from the field, wore a rumpled blue coat. But in that moment, rank and pride gave way to something more profound: reconciliation. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms and horses. Soldiers were free to return home in peace. There would be no trials, no executions. Only silence and the beginning of healing. As word of the surrender spread, Union soldiers cheered, their long war finally over. Confederate soldiers wept, hugged one another, and began the long walk home to ruined farms, burned cities, and uncertain futures. The war had cost more than 600,000 lives. Families were torn apart. the South lay devastated. And though the fighting had stopped, the battle to rebuild the nation and to define freedom had just begun. Just 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, while the Union celebrated, the nation suffered an unthinkable blow. President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had held the country together through its darkest years, was shot in the back of the head by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln had been laughing just moments before watching the comedy Our American Cousin beside his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. Booth, a well-known actor and Southern loyalist, slipped into the presidential box, aimed a pistol at the back of Lincoln's head, and fired. He leapt onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lay unconscious through the night. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at his side, whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation was stunned. Grief swept across the North. Bells tolled. Cities fell silent. Thousands lined the tracks as Lincoln's funeral train made its slow journey from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. It was not just the death of a man, it felt like the death of hope, just as peace had arrived. Lincoln had spoken not of revenge, but of malice toward none, with charity for all. He wanted to rebuild the Union not through punishment, but through healing. His assassination cast a long shadow over Reconstruction. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, but he lacked Lincoln's vision and moral authority. His efforts to bring the South back into the Union quickly without protections for newly freed African Americans would lead to political chaos and deep divisions in the years ahead. Meanwhile, other Confederate armies began to surrender. General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered to General William T. Sherman in North Carolina on April 26. Confederate forces west of the Mississippi laid down their arms in May and June. By the end of summer, the Confederacy was fully dissolved. The stars and bars were lowered. The guns were silent, but the soul of the nation remained wounded. The war had ended slavery, but freedom was still fragile. Millions of formerly enslaved people faced uncertain futures, with no land, no money, and no protection. And the question Lincoln had grappled with to the end, how to reunite the country, not just in law, but in spirit, remained unanswered. But even in death, Lincoln's legacy endured. He had kept the Union together. He had signed the Emancipation Proclamation and seen Congress pass the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery once and for all. And he had spoken to America's highest ideals, even when the nation had fallen to its lowest. The Civil War was over, but the next struggle to build a just, united America was just beginning. When the guns fell silent and the blood-soaked battlefields of the Civil War faded into memory, America was left to confront not just physical devastation, but a deep moral reckoning. The war had claimed over 600,000 lives, destroyed families, cities, and farmland. But beyond the visible scars, it reshaped the very foundation of the nation's identity, forcing Americans to ask, what kind of country are we now? At the heart of the war's moral legacy was the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. Millions of African Americans were legally free. But freedom on paper did not mean equality in life. Formerly enslaved men, women, and children faced a new and uncertain world. They were free from bondage, but not from prejudice, poverty, or violence. The Southern economy, once built on slave labor, collapsed. In its place emerged sharecropping, a system that often kept black families trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Though the Civil War ended the legal institution of slavery, it did not end racism. In many ways, the war opened a new chapter of struggle, the battle for civil rights, a fight that would last more than a century. Still, the moral shift was undeniable. Slavery had once been embedded in the Constitution. Now, its eradication was etched into the national fabric. The war had forced the country to confront the immorality of human bondage and reject it, but the political consequences of the war were equally profound. First, the war preserved the Union. The central question, could a state secede from the United States, was answered with finality, no. The idea that the country was a voluntary association of sovereign states was shattered. The federal government emerged stronger with clearer authority over the states. Second, the war expanded the power of the presidency. Abraham Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus, expanded the military, and used executive authority in ways never seen before. Though controversial, his actions redefined the presidency during wartime. Future presidents would look back to Lincoln's example in moments of national crisis. Third, the Civil War reshaped party politics. The Republican Party, founded less than a decade before the war, emerged as the dominant force in national politics. It was the party of Lincoln, of union, and of emancipation. The Democratic Party, deeply divided by the war, struggled to rebuild its identity, especially in the South, where many viewed it as the voice of resistance to Reconstruction. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Reconstruction began, a period of intense political struggle. The North tried to rebuild the South, reintegrate former Confederate states, and grant civil rights to freedmen. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to all born in the U.S., and the 15th Amendment promised voting rights regardless of race. But backlash was swift and brutal. Many Southern whites resisted these changes. Violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, terrorizing black communities and white allies. Black codes were passed to limit the freedoms of former slaves. And as Reconstruction faltered, federal troops were eventually withdrawn, leaving African Americans vulnerable once again. By the 1870s, political will in the North to enforce Reconstruction waned. Economic concerns, fatigue, and compromise led to the abandonment of Southern black citizens to the whims of white supremacist governments. Jim Crow laws would soon take root, legally segregating the South for nearly a century. So, while the political structure of the Union held, the moral promise of equality was only partially fulfilled. The Civil War also left a cultural legacy that echoed through generations. For many in the North, the war came to symbolize a noble fight for unity and liberty. For the South, the memory was more complicated. Some clung to the myth of the lost cause, portraying Confederate leaders like Lee not as traitors, but as tragic heroes defending states' rights, not slavery. This myth-making served to justify the return of white rule in the South and obscure the true cause of the war, the preservation of slavery. Yet despite the setbacks, the war planted seeds of change. Black churches, schools, and civic organizations grew. Freedmen ran for office, started businesses, and founded colleges. Activists like Frederick Douglass warned that the struggle was far from over and inspired future generations to keep fighting. Politically, the Civil War had created a stronger, more centralized United States. Morally, it had cracked the chains of slavery, even if the legacy of inequality endured. And symbolically, it had tested the very idea of democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, and proved that it would not perish from the earth. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States stood at a crossroads. The Union had been preserved, slavery abolished, but the road to national healing was far from clear. The country faced monumental questions. How would the South be rebuilt? Who would be in charge, Congress or the president? And what future awaited the 4 million newly freed African Americans? President Abraham Lincoln, before his assassination, had already laid the groundwork for bringing the Confederate States back into the Union. In 1863, he introduced the 10% plan, offering amnesty to former Confederates if 10% of a state's voters swore loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation. His approach was moderate, aiming for rapid reunification rather than punishment. But radical Republicans in Congress, like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, found this plan far too lenient. They demanded full civil rights for free people and stricter terms for reintegration. In 1864, they passed the Wade-Davis Bill, which required a majority of white male citizens in a former Confederate state to pledge loyalty before rejoining the Union. Lincoln refused to sign it. After Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. A Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union, Johnson initially seemed poised to take a hard line against former Confederates. But his actual policies shocked many Northerners. Johnson quickly issued pardons to thousands of ex-Confederates and allowed Southern states to reestablish governments with minimal oversight. Most of these governments were controlled by the same white elites who had led the South to secession. Under these new regimes, Southern legislatures began enacting black codes, laws designed to limit the rights and freedoms of African Americans. These codes forced black citizens into exploitative labor contracts, restricted their movement, and denied them legal protections. It became clear that although slavery was abolished, white supremacy still held firm in the South. In response, Congress acted. In March 1865, it established the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency tasked with helping freed slaves transition to freedom. It provided food, medical aid, education, and legal support. Despite its limited resources and constant opposition, the Bureau played a crucial role in protecting African Americans in the immediate aftermath of the war. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, granting citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteeing them equal protection under the law. When President Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode the veto, marking the first time in U.S. history that such an override passed on a major piece of legislation related to civil rights. These early steps of Reconstruction revealed deep fractures in the nation's political system. While Johnson sought a swift and forgiving reunion, radical Republicans pushed for justice, protection, and equality. The clash would set the stage for a new phase of Reconstruction. One marked by confrontation, federal intervention, and a struggle to define the true meaning of freedom in post-Civil War America. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, remains one of the most defining and transformative events in the nation's history. It was a conflict born from deep-rooted divisions, economic, political, moral, that had built up over decades, and when it finally erupted, it tore the nation apart. But while the war ended with the Union victorious and slavery abolished, its legacy would stretch far beyond the battlefield. In the aftermath of over 600,000 deaths, the United States emerged changed politically, socially, and ideologically. The war not only shaped how Americans understood freedom, citizenship, and nationhood, but also cast a long shadow that still lingers in contemporary politics and culture. The most immediate and monumental outcome of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans were legally freed. This marked the end of a brutal institution that had defined the Southern economy and way of life for centuries. But while the end of slavery was a historic moral victory, it was only the beginning of a much longer struggle for equality. The newly freed population faced enormous challenges: economic hardship, social hostility, and political disenfranchisement. The promise of freedom was quickly undercut by systems like black codes, sharecropping, and later Jim Crow segregation. Nevertheless, the Civil War laid the legal foundation for future civil rights advances, embedding in the Constitution the concepts of equality and due process that would be invoked repeatedly in the pursuit of justice. The war also radically shifted the balance of power between the federal government and the states. Before the war, the idea of state sovereignty had been strong, particularly in the South, where leaders insisted on the right to govern without federal interference, especially regarding slavery. But secession and rebellion forced the federal government to assert its authority on an unprecedented scale. The Union victory proved decisively that the United States was not merely a loose confederation of states, but a single, indivisible nation. The federal government's power expanded during and after the war through taxation, conscription, and control of infrastructure, and this set the stage for a stronger, more centralized authority in the years to come. The United States would never again be the same in terms of federal-state relations. Economically, the Civil War accelerated industrialization in the North and devastated the agrarian South. Northern factories thrived on wartime production, and the railroads became vital arteries of both military strategy and post-war commerce. When peace returned, the North's economic momentum continued, laying the groundwork for America's rise as an industrial power by the end of the 19th century. The South, on the other hand, lay in ruins. Plantations had been destroyed, labor systems had collapsed, and the region's infrastructure was in shambles. Reconstruction tried to rebuild, but it was slow, incomplete, and met with fierce resistance. Many southern states fell into cycles of poverty and political regression that would last well into the next century. The economic disparities between North and South seeded during the war would shape regional identities and political divisions long after the guns fell silent. Culturally, the Civil War left a deep imprint on the American psyche. It was the first war to be photographed extensively, and the grim images of battlefield carnage reached the public in a way that was both immediate and haunting. The nation had never experienced loss on such a scale. Almost every family knew someone who had died or returned wounded. Entire towns mourned together. The war ushered in new rituals of remembrance, including Decoration Day, now Memorial Day, and created military cemeteries where Union and Confederate dead were laid to rest. Literature, art, and music of the post-war period often echoed with themes of grief, sacrifice, and reconciliation. The emotional toll of the war, though intangible, was vast and enduring. But memory became a battlefield of its own. In the North, the war was remembered as a fight to save the Union and abolish slavery. Abraham Lincoln was sanctified as a martyr of liberty. In the South, however, a different narrative emerged, the lost cause. This interpretation painted the Confederate struggle as noble, romanticized plantation life, and minimized slavery's role as the central cause of the war. Confederate generals, particularly Robert E. Lee, were elevated to mythical status. Monuments were erected, school books rewritten, and generations taught that the South had fought for states' rights and honor. This mythology, though historically inaccurate, gained enormous influence, helping to entrench white supremacy and justify the rise of segregation and racial violence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The lost cause narrative also contributed to the enduring cultural divide between North and South and continues to fuel debates over flags, statues, and history curricula to this day.